everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Stacey Aldridge LCSW. Today we are going to be talking about mindfulness and addiction, specifically how people who are in recovery from addictive behaviors or addiction to drugs or alcohol can use mindfulness as a way to help them along their recovery journey. Sources talking about mindfulness in addiction recovery, and I will have the links to all of those in the description box below, so if you're interested, please be sure to read those articles in their entirety. Nearly 24 million Americans are struggling with drug and alcohol addiction, which is a really shockingly high number. And a lot of research has been done going all the way back to 2005 that I could find on whether or not mindfulness can be beneficial for people who are in recovery from drugs and alcohol. A 2014 study showed that even if people who had been through this program did relapse, they experienced fewer days using the substance before they started on their recovery journey again. So that alone is very promising. I also found a study that was published in 2013 that looked at neuroscience of mindfulness when used in addiction recovery. And it was really interesting because they described active addiction as mindlessness. So really the opposite of mindfulness, because you're engaging in these behaviors that are instinctual without really thinking about it. So I found that characterization to be really interesting. In that study, which was done by Garland, Frohliger, and Howard, which I'll also link to in the description box, they found that using mindfulness actually changed the neuroplasticity of the brain. So damage that was done physically to the brain when a person was abusing substances, mindfulness actually helped to repair that. That's pretty just mind-boggling, isn't it? So I hope that that's given you guys a little bit of new information about mindfulness as it relates to addiction recovery. Today I'm doing something a little bit different on my channel. I'm actually going to be talking to somebody else and doing a little bit of an interview. And he didn't really have a choice in this since he is my boyfriend. But I'm going to go ahead and welcome Jon Rost to my program. Jon has been in recovery for almost 4 years from drugs and alcohol, and he is also a mathematics professor at a local community college, but I hope that you don't hold that against him. So Jon, tell me a little bit about how you discovered mindfulness and got involved in it.
I studied a number of different religions throughout my life. Whenever I entered recovery, it was stressed to me that I had to embark upon spiritual growth. And so I studied spirituality and searched for spirituality, and most of the things that I found in connection with spirituality had to do with Eastern philosophies like Buddhism, Taoism. And what I like to think of is that if Buddhism is the steering wheel of the car that's choosing the direction of your life, then mindfulness is how the wheels actually touch the road when trying to live by those ideals.
So you can't have one without the other kind of thing?
Not in my spiritual growth, but certainly I'm sure other people might feel differently.
So tell me a little bit about how you actually applied mindfulness in the very beginning of your recovery, or were you already further into your recovery when you really discovered it?
Certainly my understanding and my practice of mindfulness has evolved over the last few years. Early on, it was a matter of learning to sit with my feelings. Mm-hmm. In its essence, alcoholism and addiction is about changing the way you feel through an activity or through a substance. And learning to accept your own feelings and not try to change them was a huge part of, relapse prevention early on, and it still is today in my recovery. One of the big problems that society has with addiction and alcoholism is an issue of judgment. We look at people who suffer from addiction and alcoholism, and society does tend to judge them as being inferior in some way. And so the idea of learning to not judge ourselves or to not judge our feelings and then transferring that and attempting to not judge others is huge. You know, being able to, I think Pema Chodron talks about it a lot, being able to look at a situation or a feeling non-judgmentally. Right? That's huge. Whenever I'm having a bad day, whenever I don't feel well, I look at that and I see, okay, I'm experiencing that I don't feel well, I'm experiencing these negative emotions or negative physical sensations, but accepting them non-judgmentally, not seeing them as a horrible bad thing that must be gotten rid of. It definitely helps. The other thing that I think is key for me with mindfulness is, like you said, whenever you were citing some of that research about mindfulness being the opposite of addiction.
Right.
Certainly trying to pay very particular attention, not only to what you do, but how you do it. Trying to do things intentionally, choosing to do a particular behavior or choosing not to do a particular behavior, but doing it with intention, not automatic. Right. That's a huge part of mindfulness, and it's a huge part of addiction recovery. You know, most of the new way that we learn to live is not natural to us when we start recovery. We have to choose, this is the way I'm going to live, this is the way I'm going to behave, and this is the way I'm going to choose to attempt to see the world around me.
That's actually one of the things that really struck me about the research was characterizing addiction as mindlessness, because I almost, in my brain, I sort of went to scientific studies that they do with mice, and you know they know that the mice will continue hitting the button, and it sort of made me think of that, like the mouse will continue hitting the button to get the heroin until he dies. I wondered if that was offensive at all to someone who is in recovery, being characterized as being mindless for that period of your life.
I can only speak for myself on that. I can't certainly say whether other people are offended or not. I know that I personally am not. I've even spoken before about how when we're in active addiction, we are like animals, zero impulse control. The urge or desire comes into our brain, and we do exactly what we urge to do or have a desire to do without any thoughts of consequences for ourselves or the ones around us. And to me, I think that is the kind of the exact difference between animalistic behavior with zero impulse and everything being urges to human behavior where we can learn to adapt and to choose and to decide, to make decisions. I can still remember the very first time in recovery that I wanted a drink and I decided not to. And my mind was blown away. I was driving down the road. I almost had to pull off of the road because I was just like, oh my goodness, so this is how this works. I can decide that I'm not going to take a drink. So the idea of mindlessness versus mindfulness, I think, is the absolute best example or description of alcoholism and addiction versus recovery and mindfulness. They are complete opposites of each other.
And that was one of the things that they had mentioned in the study that I talked about in the beginning. Mindfulness facilitates a novel adaptive response to people, places, and things, which if you are in recovery from addiction or if you've worked in addiction recovery, you're very familiar with this idea of people, places, and things, the things that trigger that desire to use or drink or act out. The practice of mindfulness in the face of that stress, that mindfulness helps the stress reactivity and it suppresses it while disrupting addictive automaticity, resulting in an increased ability to regulate and recover from addictive urges. So this is why mindfulness is so helpful in relapse prevention, because it's actually teaching people that tool to use in those moments where you're confronted with that urge.
We talk a lot in recovery about not thinking too much about the future or dwelling too much on the past and trying to stay just in today. And I think mindfulness takes that even a step further, that every moment where we are, we want to be fully present.
Right.
Everybody has different understandings of parts of the steps and whatnot. For me, one of the things that was key was defining sanity versus insanity. And sanity is the unconditional embrace of reality at all costs. That's the way I define sanity for myself. So in my recovery and in my mindfulness, I want to be right here where I am. So even if I'm in a stressful situation or a frustrating situation or even a tempting situation, I can easily take a step back and experience and appreciate this moment in time, again, non-judgmentally, which I certainly would not be able to do if I was impaired with drugs, alcohol, or addictive behaviors. So the mindfulness aspect there just kind of reinforces an appreciation for clear-mindedness and for real presence in our lives, which we would not be able to have if we weren't actively in recovery.
Which is actually the essence of mindfulness, is being in the present moment, whether you're practicing mindfulness as somebody in recovery or not.
Most of us, when we were still, what we say is out there, when we were still in active alcoholism and addiction, we failed to fundamentally believe that it was possible to live a life sober and in recovery. That's what kept most of us out there for so long.
And I like how you made the distinction between sober and in recovery. So could you tell us a little bit about what you feel is the difference between those two things?
Well, sober is a physical state. Right? As long as you don't put substances in your body and as long as you don't indulge your addictive behaviors, then you can say that you're sober. I can tell you from my experience that sobriety, without living an active life of recovery and spiritual growth, is as miserable or more miserable than being in active addiction and active alcoholism. So once you stop putting the bad substances in your body and you stop engaging in the negative behaviors, there has to be a replacement with something else.
Right.
And that's what recovery does. So staying sober keeps me from damaging myself. Recovery gives me the opportunity to live and to grow in this life that I have. And I find that mindfulness both assists in my recovery and my spiritual growth and helps prevent me from relapsing and going back into active addiction and alcoholism.
Well, to finish everything up, for people who are in recovery and are just being introduced to this concept of mindfulness, what suggestions would you give to somebody who does want to apply this to their new life of recovery?
Well, I could tell you that for me, part of it started with the idea of meditation. In the 11th step of Alcoholics Anonymous, it specifically says, sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him. And for someone who is not overtly religious, prayer can be kind of difficult. And so I used personally the idea of meditation as kind of a bridge through that 11th step in order to improve my conscious contact with my higher power. Just stopping and breathing and paying attention to the breath tends to immediately calm me, center me within myself, and understand that the world around me is not me, if that makes any sense. Now, my meditation practice has grown over the years. I tend to meditate 10 to 20 minutes a day whenever I have time. I, again, just find that keeps me absolutely present with where I am. It keeps me completely aware of my own body, my own feelings, my own thoughts, and it keeps me centered in the present moment.
So any final thoughts for anyone that is watching?
If you want to learn more about mindfulness, the best author that I've ever run across about it is Jon Kabat-Zinn. I'm sure she'll put some kind of a link or something in the description. absolutely masterful writer about the ideas and the practice of mindfulness in your life in a totally non-religious, non-judgmental, just spiritual, healthy way.
All right. Well, thank you, Jon, for taking the time to come here and talk.
Glad to be here.
All right, everyone. Well, I hope that you have enjoyed this discussion on a new aspect of mindfulness. And I hope that you've gotten something out of it. If you have any questions for Jon, you can leave them in comments on the video, and I will be sure to have him respond. And as he said, I will have some resources that we talked about in the description box as well, so definitely check those out. If you like what you see, please subscribe and also hit the bell next to the subscription button so you actually get a notification every time a new video is posted. Thanks everyone for watching.
If anybody wants to find me, I'll be in the last place you would look, in a place where people used to